Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone had a relaxing holiday season and a pleasant new year. 2026 should be an exciting year in the art world, and we can't wait to cover it here on the podcast. And I can't think of a better way to start the year than with our guest in this week's episode, Tim Schneider, founder of The Gray Market, a leading voice mapping the forces shaping the business of contemporary art from the inside and out. I definitely recommend checking out Tim's Substack if you don't subscribe already. You can visit by going to thegraymarket.substack.com to read his in-depth reporting and coverage. At the beginning of each year, Tim shares his predictions for the art market. And what I really appreciate is that he actually revisits those predictions at the end of the year to see how accurate they turned out. Tim has just released his full list of predictions for 2026. You can find them now on a Substack, and he's kind enough to join us in this week's episode to discuss a selection of those predictions. We hope you enjoy the thoughtful and fun conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Tim, Happy New Year. Thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here, Adam.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned in the intro, you just published your 2026 predictions for the art market on your Substack, which I definitely recommend everyone check out. And we're going to chat about a few of them today. But before we get into 2026, I wanted to ask you how your 2025 predictions ultimately played out. Can you share perhaps one that turned out correct?
Yeah, sure. So I made 7 predictions in 2025 as well. One of the ones that I got right was that at least one high-end commercial gallery will announce the opening of some kind of physical space in Saudi Arabia. And I wasn't surprised that I got that right necessarily, but I was surprised why I got it right, which is that the gallery that announced they were going to open in Saudi Arabia was Kolnagi, the kind of well-regarded old master-centric gallery that's been around since 1760. They announced that they are going to open their 5th location in Riyadh.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I thought maybe there's a possibility we could see some gallery expansion there, but that wasn't the gallery I had in mind. But hey, counts as a correct prediction regardless. And can you share maybe one that didn't turn out correct?
So I went into 2025 really thinking a lot about what was happening in crypto market, especially vis-a-vis Trump and his administration's boisterous chest beating effort to really pump up crypto. And I sort of jumped from that to the notion that there might be a real big resurgence in the NFT market, specifically through the lens of the idea that people's every days, the first 5,000 days, would go back on the market. Obviously, that did not happen. And not only did that not happen, the sort of larger resurgence that I saw that as being a proxy of, that also didn't happen, as most people listening to this podcast know. But I think it speaks to something really interesting about the sort of larger ways that people in the US especially are looking at speculative assets. Like if you look at why the NFT market didn't end up coming back, part of it is that a lot of the speculative energy that was in crypto and originally going into NFTs instead shifted into things like meme coins, where there isn't even really any kind of visual component or any overture towards the idea that this is actually something that has value beyond the ability to make money. And a lot of people who were speculating on NFTs went in that direction instead. And now they're sort of spreading their money out even further to things like prediction markets and like weird financial tools like 0-day options and all kinds of things.
Yeah, that in itself is a really fascinating trend. It's not specific to the art market, but I think it's a broader trend relating to this type of speculative, bet it all mentality, in particular, younger people who maybe feel stuck, in regard to their income and net worth, and you have AI looming over job security, and some feel that they might just take these big swings on things like prediction markets. Anyways, that's probably a separate conversation for another podcast. But going back to what you said, we've actually touched on NFTs a bit on the podcast. It's never really our focus, of course, but we did actually have Beeple on the podcast just before Basel, Miami, and it was actually really refreshing to hear him talk so openly about what it felt like to experience the boom and the collapse of the NFT market. And he was incredibly self-aware and candid, honestly, in a way that most traditional artists aren't. Anyway, so let's jump into 2026, and you're kind enough to share and discuss some of your predictions. As I said, you can get the full list on your Substack. But one prediction that I wanted to chat about with you is art market dysmorphia will continue. The number of pre-existing galleries that physically expands will be almost the same, plus or minus 5, as the number that physically downsizes. Now, you coined this term, art market dysmorphia, previously. For our listeners not familiar, what exactly do you mean by that term, and why do you think it might continue in 2026?
Sure. So, art market dysmorphia is a term that I came up with towards the end of last year because, from my perspective as an analyst, as I'm trying to get a handle on not only what I think about what's happening in the market, but what the rest of the sort of constituencies within the art industry think is happening. I couldn't recall another year where I was getting so many different reads about how healthy or not the overall market was. I would get people who would say that things were absolutely awful. I would get people who would say that things were just like ready to get back on a rocket ship and go to the moon again, and just everything in between. And the conclusion that I came to eventually was that if you look at especially what's been happening in the gallery sector and you really break it down, what you find is that we've been getting good news and bad news in almost equal proportion the whole way through last year. And I think that's going to continue into this year. But the idea of art market dysmorphia is it comes from body dysmorphia, which is the notion that what people who have this disorder see when it comes to their own bodies is not necessarily what's actually there. It's what they believe to be true about themselves. And so art market dysmorphia is essentially the notion that you can see whatever you want to see in the market, which is not super unusual. But I think that what separates now from kind of past points where you might have been able to do that is that there's now enough evidence on both sides that you can make a semi-credible argument for why you're right. And that, I think, is especially true within the world of gallery closures and gallery expansions, which is, of course, a kind of proxy that a lot of people use justifiably for how healthy the gallery sector is. And when I went through and did my best analysis of how many pre-existing galleries closed over the course of 2025 versus how many pre-existing galleries physically expanded, what I found was that the number was dead even. You had 24 pre-existing galleries that either physically downsized or permanently closed. And you had 24 pre-existing galleries that either moved into new, larger spaces in the same city or opened new spaces in new cities. And I think that this general trend is going to continue through 2026. I'm giving myself a kind of margin of error of 5 galleries one way or the other so that I can pad it a little bit. But in general, I think that the notion that what we're about to go into this year is some grand resurgence and everybody's going to come out of the storm that we've just weathered and be great again. I think that that's a little bit of wishful thinking, or maybe a lot of wishful thinking. And in reality, the year that we're going to experience is going to be closer to 2025 than I think a lot of people would like to believe.
Yeah, hearing your explanation of that term really resonates with me. It's something I experienced firsthand several times over the last year. I mean, one clear example that comes to mind is how at the same art fair, I'd have completely different conversations with different galleries about how the fair was going. For example, some would say it wasn't going very well, it was tough. Others would say it's going okay. The things they thought would sell, and we'll have to see how the rest of the fair plays out. And some would say it's going great. And I think that contrast made me realize you can't really paint the contemporary art market with this broad brush anymore. It's no longer like it was a few years ago when nearly every booth was a sellout or close to it. There's much more nuance now. Ultimately, quality and pricing matter far more than they used to. And I think those factors are ultimately shaping not only a gallery's fair experience throughout the year, but likely their financials for the entire year as a whole. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how 2026 plays out in that regard. So your next prediction I want to get into is the big three auction houses will make more than 2 times as much money from selling wine and spirits as they will from selling young contemporary art. Now, when I first saw this, and I imagine when most people first saw this, they probably thought it was a crazy prediction because there's been so much buzz about young contemporary art over the last several years. And on the flip side, if we think about wine and spirits, well, we know more broadly, less people are drinking alcohol. Things like Ozempic are also having an impact on alcohol consumption. But actually, based on last year's numbers, it seems like this one might be likely, or at least not nearly as wild of a prediction as one might think.
Right. So the first part of this is that the prediction is actually about the class of art that we're referring to as young contemporary art, which is ArtTactic's term for artists who are aged 40 or younger. So that kind of brings this a little bit down into a narrower and more achievable sense of things. But the reason that I wanted to make this prediction, why I believe that it will come true, is that I think it speaks to two really interesting dynamics within the auction market. And you've started to play them out already in your explanation. One is this notion of, first off, the luxury market being more and more of a focus within the kind of upper echelon or uppermost echelon, I should say, of the auction world. And even though it may not quite compute at first, like wine and spirits are considered part of luxury. So that's the first thing. We have this kind of major surge that's been going on in that general overall category for a while. And when I was digging into ArtTactic's final year-end reports on 2025, one of the items that stuck out to me was that sales of fine wine and rare spirits at auction were actually big gainers in 2025. At Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips, wine was up almost 40% by value to about $190 million with fees. And spirits were up around 25% by volume, and they generated around $23 million with fees in total sales across those houses. So you add that up, and you end up with around $213 million worth of high-end booze being sold by Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips. So that's one side of this. The other side of it is what we've been seeing happening within this tranche of young contemporary artists. And that is an area that I think, Adam, you can speak to this even more knowledgeably than I can because I feel like you move within that space a lot. But it's an area where there was a ton of auction sector excitement in the immediate post-pandemic years. You had multiple artists under the age of 40 who had managed to sell at least one work for $1 million or more at auction around like 2022. And ever since then, there's been a real serious decline within the auction sector for that same type of work. So again, to go back to ArtTactics numbers, young contemporary art, so again, work by artists age 40 or younger, in 2025 was down almost 40% by value year over year last year, and the grand total was about $62.5 million. So that's not very much in the grand scheme of things. That's like one very good Picasso painting. And you have these kinds of ultimately you end up with these cross currents where on the one hand young contemporary art has been sliding. I think that that will at least stabilize, if not recover a little bit in 2026. But I don't foresee a situation where it's all of a sudden going to double or triple in value because people really want to rush in and get speculative about this space. And on the other side, I think that the surge in wine and spirit sales that you're seeing in the auction sector is pretty likely to at least continue at the same level, if not level up even further. And when you put the two together, I think that any gains that are made by the young contemporary art sector will not really get anywhere close to whatever's happening on the fine wines and spirit side. Ergo, at the end of all of it, I expect Christie, Sotheby's, and Phillips collectively to sell more than twice as much wine and spirits by value as works by young contemporary artists.
Yeah, as you break it down like you did, it really makes a lot of sense. And with contemporary artists, younger ones specifically, this is something we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast. There really was an enormous amount of speculation, particularly coming out of China, coming out of Asia. I remember having multiple conversations with people at auction houses who basically told me that if Asian buyers suddenly disappeared from the market for these young contemporary artists, that prices for a lot of them would cut in half at auction simply because the top several bidders at these speculative price points were almost always Asian clients. And we've seen Chinese collectors pull back from speculative buying and honestly purchasing less overall amid economic challenges in China, particularly related to the real estate market. And I also remember that when these young artists were achieving astronomical prices at auction, I would talk to more established collectors, those who have lived through multiple market cycles, and they just weren't tempted at those levels. Hypothetically, for example, you might see an artist trade at auction for $1 million, and you talk to one of these established collectors, and they'd only be interested in that artist at maybe $200,000 or $250,000. And I honestly just can't recall another moment when the gap between auction prices and what seasoned collectors were willing to pay was so wide. And so what we're seeing today is the art market has become more discerning, more selective, and I think the prices for younger contemporary artists have stabilized now and will continue in that direction in 2026. And so moving on to a really interesting prediction you make for this year, either Frieze or Art Basel will announce an acquisition or partnership to extend the brand beyond its fair calendar and into another business sector outside of art. I found this prediction to be really interesting, really creative, and it allowed me a chance to reflect on these two brands. I'm often just thinking about how they're conducting their fairs and when the next fair is and what the experience was like. But these brands are very valuable. They have an association with them of being luxury, of putting on luxury events, large scale events that take over a city. And I think there probably is a lot of value in that, not to mention their logistical knowledge of being able to actually organize these types of events. What kind of sector outside the art world do you think could be plausible for these brands to enter into?
I think that the most likely target here is something in the media space, the promotional space, or even potentially the hospitality space. But we'll have to see exactly which form it will take. I think that really from a 10,000 foot view, the reason that I wanted to weigh in on this dynamic within the fair sector is that, I mean, God, how long have you and I and other people out there been talking about the idea of fair fatigue, meaning that there's just too many damn art fairs year after year for everybody to get to? I mean, it's been like 15 years at this point. And I think that on the one hand, we have hit a point with the fair calendar where nobody realistically expects to be able to make it to anything, to everything anymore, I should say. So I think that there is a sort of partitioning that's been happening slowly in terms of regionality. You have certain people in certain parts of the world who are going to go to certain fairs, and they're probably not going to go to most of the other ones. So that's one part of this. And then also, if you look at these entities as businesses in a grander sense, they're businesses that have a mandate and a desire to grow. And when you reach a point where the number of fairs, meaning the physical trade shows that you can put on every year, when that has maxed out, you have to look somewhere else for growth. And I think both Frieze and Art Basel have been doing that in various ways over the course of the past several years. And I just expect that it's going to be a thing that gets powered up even further in the years ahead. In particular, I think that there is a growing sense within the kind of larger media and culture sphere that events are a great thing to do, but obviously art fairs are incredibly expensive and incredibly complex to put on. And if you look instead at something like, say, the New York Times Deal Book Summit, or the Aspen Ideas Fest, or Davos, or whatever it might be, these are huge convenings that are incredibly, incredibly powerful that I think are great businesses from as far as I can tell. And they're nowhere near as complex, or I should say they're nowhere near as expensive, I think, to put on as getting a few hundred dealers to show up, bring all of the artwork that they can fit into their booths, and spend 4 days trying to move as much as possible into the hands of collectors month after month after month. So this is an area where I think we're going to end up seeing some movement. And what form it takes, I think it's probably still too early to tell exactly. But again, if you look at the kind of more extended portfolios that each of these companies has done, then you end up seeing these glimmers of maybe a new direction for it to take.
Well, I think it's a really great prediction and a great idea, honestly, and it's something that the brands should explore. I'm sure they've been exploring it, but I'm very curious now to see if one of them actually enters into a business sector outside of art. So, the last prediction we're going to discuss today is multiple US museums will financially guarantee artworks at auction. Now, I don't think all of our listeners are even familiar with the fact that any museum has ever guaranteed an artwork at auction. Of course, we're referring to the Toledo Museum, which has been in the news recently for actually guaranteeing some works at auction and making some money in that process. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Toledo Museum's recent guarantee activities and if you think other museums could actually cut through perhaps their biggest obstacle, internal bureaucracy, to participate in guarantees themselves?
Yeah, I think that internal bureaucracy is definitely a big part of this, but the broader idea here, to me, as somebody who is a pragmatist to a fault, makes a ton of sense. Like, let's be honest, the museum funding landscape right now is pretty grim. It has been getting worse and worse for several years. And if you look at what a financial guarantee is, ultimately, what you're doing as a third party backer is twofold. You're coming in advance of the auction and saying, I'm interested in buying this work. I will put in a bid now at a certain level. And if nobody beats me, then I get the work at that price, less a discount, basically, because I am doing a service for you as the auction house, because you no longer have to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to find a buyer for this piece when it comes to showtime. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is if somebody does come in and beat me on the price of this bid, then I get a consolation prize for that, which is effectively a financing fee of a different kind, where I'm getting a percentage of the upside as the guarantor. And again, that's because I have come in and basically removed the risk for the auction house. So we mostly think of private collectors being the biggest source of financial guarantees, third-party guarantees to be more specific, at auction. And that's true, and that's usually the case. But there is at least this one example that we know of, and this is not my reporting, this was from Margaret Kerrigan at ArtNet News. But what we now know is that the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio, where I'm from, has come in and done this a few different times since 2023. And the museum's director, Adam Levine, who is known as, depending on how you think about things, either a kind of forward-thinking maverick or potentially a scourge on all that is good and right and pure in museums, he has talked about how the museum made, I believe, around $2 million worth of financing fees from 2023 to the end of 2024 based on guarantees that they've made. And his perspective, which again makes a lot of sense to me, is to say, listen, we're only coming in and doing this on works that we as the museum actually want to have in our permanent collection. We're still running them through the curatorial department that matters. We're running them through the acquisition committee, and everybody's come to the conclusion that we would like to own this work. So if we can come to that decision the same way that we would if it was just a private deal and we knew that we were the only other party that was interested in buying it, and we can put in a bid on it in advance at a price that makes sense to us, and we end up getting the work, then fantastic. And if we don't, then we get a consolation prize, basically, which can be like a meaningful amount of money. Now, it's not going to be enough for them to go out and build a new wing or something like that. But if you're a smaller or even a mid-sized regional institution and you can make an extra million or $2 at auction by doing this kind of a move, and like, why wouldn't you? I tend to feel like the biggest, as you alluded to, the biggest reason that museums would shy away from doing this is this, and it's just that it's so far outside the norms of what a museum should do and how it should or shouldn't interact with the market. But we're just getting to a point where I think that the larger public funding landscape is so dire that institutions around the country are going to have to get more and more creative with how it is that they manage to keep the lights on. And this to me seems like one really interesting possibility because you already have an example of somebody who has done it successfully. Like it's always the toughest to be the first person or the first institution to make this move. But once you see somebody else do it, then it becomes a lot easier to say, okay, maybe I should try that too.
Exactly. And when I think about the museum model, it really just underscores how difficult it is for institutions to do something genuinely different. I mean, thinking outside the box and taking on something potentially polarizing involves real risk. And that's why I think what Toledo took on is such a great idea and a really brave idea. And for them, earning a few $1 million, that can go a long way. I mean, museums generally are in a tough financial shape right now. And honestly, any museum would welcome a few $1 million. But for a museum like Toledo, I think that impact is really, really significant. And this got me thinking, honestly, more broadly, museums shouldn't be afraid to occasionally put on a collector's hat or mindset and really dig into the weeds when it comes to the art market. I remember last year speaking with a curator who was considering acquiring a work from a gallery, and I suggested they look at auction instead. They could acquire the same work, a comparable work, even a better work for honestly half the price because the prices were just too expensive at the gallery. And it wasn't even part of their thought process. And I'm not honestly not sure they would have felt comfortable doing it, but that kind of savings could free up resources, whether it's to acquire additional works for the collection or for other purposes at the museum. So I think perhaps this is a lesson for more museums, whether it's guaranteeing works or honestly just looking at the art market and weighing all of your options as you make acquisition decisions and other types of decisions for the museum. And so before we let you go, you have agreed to come up with one additional prediction that isn't on your Substack. That's you came up with exclusive for the podcast. So we really appreciate that. So we'd love to hear that. And then I'll actually share a prediction myself for 2026.
So, as somebody who lives in New York, there has, of course, been a lot of focus, a lot of chatter about Zoran Mamdani becoming the mayor and trying to govern on a platform of democratic socialism. Obviously, there are a lot of people who have a lot of money, either personally or in their companies that are based in New York, who have really rallied against him, at least while he was still campaigning. And since he won, there's been a lot of speculation about what the upshot of this is going to be for these very wealthy people and corporations that were really beating the drum about how they were going to leave town if Zoran came in and actually started trying to implement things like universal childcare or whatever else by raising taxes. I think that this is largely bogus. I think that it's mostly a matter of making threats to try to ward off a thing that you don't want to see happen, but that when that thing actually does happen, it's going to end up just being a lot of hot air. And so my prediction and tailored to the art world is that we will not see any major New York-based collectors move out of New York City because of Zoran's policies in 2026.
Oh, I like that prediction a lot because that's not just a art market specific prediction, but something that many in the broader news will be covering and monitoring to see if there is any type of impact from Mondani taking over as mayor. So that'll be one that'll be fun to follow along with and see if that one holds true or not. Now, my prediction for 2026 is that a number of young artists, not a huge number, but a number of young artists whose markets have cooled off after early success will begin trying to sell art directly to their followers on Instagram. This is a little bit of a bold prediction. I'm not sure if it'll come true, but I think if an artist's sales have slowed significantly and they've built a sizable social media following, they may come to their own conclusion that they should promote available works, whether it's through Instagram posts or stories, and offer them to their followers at a larger discount than a gallery could. An artist and a gallery generally have a 50-50 split, but if an artist decides to go on their own, selling it on their social media, maybe they'll offer a 50% discount or a 40% discount or some type of discount that simply couldn't be possible for a gallery to extend. And I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not really critiquing the current system we have. I'm just pointing out that I think it remains a possibility because we're at a moment when artists are more empowered and I think more directly connected to collectors because of social media like Instagram than at almost any other point or probably any other point in history. So I'm very curious how that dynamic plays out if certain artists are really struggling to sell their work through their galleries. So we'll just have to see if that comes to fruition as well. Tim, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast. We really appreciate this annual tradition of having you on to unveil your art market predictions for the year. And if our listeners don't already, we definitely recommend they subscribe to your Substack, thegraymarket.substack.com. We appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much for having me on, Adam. Also, to your listeners, if you want to follow me on Instagram, my handle is at @the_gray_market. And I will also plug very quickly here that if you're in New York on Wednesday, January 21st, we're going to be doing the first ever Gray Market live event at Olney Gleason in Chelsea. So I'll be in conversation there with my good friend and the kind of modern day Renaissance man, Hunter Braithwaite, about my predictions and kind of larger scope of what's happening in the art business. And then I'll be in conversation with another good friend of mine and former colleague, Ben Davis, the national art critic at ArtNet News, about what Ben is seeing in the I guess what Ben expects to see in the art world, meaning on the art making and kind of discourse side of things in 2026. So if you're here, come by, totally free, open to the public, join us. We'll have some fun. Hopefully, we'll make you a little bit smarter about what's going to happen in the year, and you'll have a good time doing it.
Can't wait. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much again, Tim. Speak soon.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Take care.